Welcome to Writer's Life, an ongoing conversation with writers, authors, and folks in the publishing industry. I'm your host, Marvel Harrison, Publishing Director, Mimbres Press of Western New Mexico University. It is a pleasure to share a conversation today with Jack Crocker, who has two books of poetry, The Last Resort from 2009 and The Algorithm of I, 2021, which is Mimbres Press inaugural book, and we are very proud of it. His poems have appeared in the Texas Review, Southern Poetry Review, Mississippi Review, and other journals in fiction. And he just has a wealth of information and history, and has been engaged in writing both lyrics and otherwise for a long time. Currently lives in Silver City, New Mexico, and is a provost at Western New Mexico University. And welcome to Writer's Life, Jack.
Marvel, thanks very much for having me. Just also, I know your background with the press, and I really appreciate and thank you for all you did to get the Mimbres Press up and running and keeping it going now.
Well, it's good folks like you that are going to continue to keep the story alive. And you know, you bring to the world a life with a varied and enticing history. Along the way, you started writing verse and lyrics. And how do you make sense out of how you got started writing, Jack?
I think it goes back, and it's probably, one of those typical stories. I was always interested in music and in writing, even in elementary school, where I became an avid reader. But it was in the ninth grade when I had one of those English teachers that we all look back on, who praised my attempts at some poetry. And that is one of those instances in a young person's life that oftentimes can set them on a particular path. So that was sort of the beginning of my interest in poetry.
I think we often overlook how a moment of touching another's spirit can last a lifetime. And, that's the beauty of teachers, coaches, people in our world that you only know for a short time, but can make such a remarkable impact on who you are.
Yeah, very much so. And of course, I was coming along in the 60s. It was a time of bursting creativity, as well as controversies. But I can remember, one of the first influences besides Lula Mae Jones, my English teacher, as we were reading the Romantic poets, and I think they really speak to that youth sense of rebellion, so that was another, at least in terms of poetry content, influence. But also, I was growing up in a Baptist church, and there were the hymns that have all of the elements of poetry with the music. So that was part of the milieu that I was growing up in.
I think sometimes hymns get overlooked. They're way more about the words than the music. I think in general, they're difficult to actually often play and accompany because it's really about what's being said and sung than about the music behind it.
Yeah, and in some ways, and as I went on to write lyrics and sign a recording contract for my pathway to being a country music rockabilly star, which never happened. But looking back, there are certain hymns, especially the robust ones, that are really a rock and roll flavor, and so it had that kind of spiritual, the spiritual influence as well.
Well, that's wonderful. What happened to that recording contract?
I had a record released. I had an album, and after a while, I could see myself at 40, 50 years old singing in Holiday Inn lounges. And since since I never, since I wasn't an overnight success, and I had already gone to graduate school and had enough degrees to have a full-time job as a professor, my life drifted to being a university professor that I became aware of in my own life. I was coming of age after my undergraduate degree. I had a fellowship to University of Mississippi, and there was a time of the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War. So, I became part of that generation's experiences with major transformations that were happening in society.
How did you come to putting together that first book of poetry? What were your transitions that actually accumulated into a poetry book?
The Last Resort, published by the Texas Review Press. I had started obviously writing poems while I was also in my beginnings as a university professor, and was having a good bit of success publishing. You mentioned some of the journals that I was in, and so I finally decided, why not put together a collection and see if I can get them published. The poems are not, the themes are not unlike the ones now in the Algorithm of I, the new one, because they came out of my experiences growing up in the Mississippi Delta, and also trying to confront the conflicts that I had with the culture, and so that was part of The Last Resort is actually the title poem. The poem is about the last resort being I could go back to the farm. I grew up on a cotton farm, and that the land would take me back in, but there's the irony and the idea that would be the last resort. Resort as the last thing I wanted to do, as well as resort in terms of going back and having a kind of relax and resort type life. So that's sort of kind of the flavor of my first book.
Well, maybe a person can launch better when there is a last resort, when you do have a backup plan.
Yeah, and I guess my backup plan was to continue in universities, and of course, many years as a professor, but then as my friends accused me of going to the dark side when I became an administrator and a provost.
You know, your poetry, both in The Last Resort and in The Algorithm of I, just come from a depth of personal experience and reflection that is very moving. And I was wondering, do you ever feel vulnerable in sharing that history and putting it on paper and being so open with it?
I think that's in many years of teaching creative writing, always was the students in the poetry classes who you start with what you're feeling usually, and oftentimes those feelings are put you in a very vulnerable exposure, and oftentimes also because of that, I joke with other friends of mine who taught creative writing for a long time. We all understand that beginning poets, and especially students, writing out of those initial feelings, it becomes a kind of sacred experience that I use this came out of the blood flowing through my heart, and I don't dare change it. So it's sometimes it's hard to, you have to be careful in criticizing that kind of approach. But part of that is the vulnerability that's being expressed. And I think so much of poetry comes out, especially lyrical poetry, and that long line of confessional poets that we have, and that was very much an influence on me. But I often say that that poetry, writing that kind of poetry, is a narcissism expressed by imagination. And so, to me, so much of poetry, even if it's not using the first person pronoun, it still is coming out of who we are.
Right. Well, I think that our courage is maybe built on our vulnerability. We get a little confused sometimes in our society that courage is about strength, when really it takes way, way more guts, if you will, to pour your heart out than to stay stoic.
Yeah, and part of the vulnerability, and one of the things that you face as a writer, and especially as a poet, is that courage, but also there comes a time when you have to say, I'm gonna tell my truth as I see it, because sometimes it's easy to go around the truth, or to find ways that will hide it. But when you look at the great poems, and to me, the best poetry, it contains, sometimes the truth is brutal, sometimes it's pleasurable, but to me, the final judgment is, did I capture the truth of what I was trying to say?
What is it then that you tell or have told or would be willing to share with writers about that creative process? What are some nudges that you would have to move them forward?
For me, the typical beginning with poets, the beginning poets, and especially students, and those who are not going to become professional writers, is cliches are so easy. And oftentimes the cliches are there because a lack of reading. And I always told my creative writing classes that, one, I wasn't even sure creativity could be taught, and the other was that I'm going to teach you more creative reading than creative writing, and so to me that was a way to read widely, and especially other poets. Not only could you see what's possible, but you also could see what's been done, and say, well, I shouldn't go that route, or that's already a cliche. So the reading habits become very important as well.
Well, speaking of reading, would you be willing to read a poem for us out of your algorithm of I?
I'll be glad to.
Thank you.
The title poem, Algorithm of I, deals primarily with the question, how much are we programmed? How much of the brain is an algorithm, and how much do we have free will? And so one of the ironies of that poem is, I think, it's the I, the pronoun I, interrogating the brain, but the irony is that it's probably the brain interrogating itself. So that's the title poem. But since we're talking about writing poetry, I have a poem in the artifice section. This one is kind of a tongue-in-cheek, sarcastic poem, but also with some, I hope, positive directions. And all poets suffer rejection, obviously, and the whole aspect of rewriting. So this poem is called Poetry Lesson. It's in 6 sections. Section 1. The poem is too accessible, the editor said, which I had come to learn meant it was too transparent, or more simply, too easy to understand, assuming there was meaning for which to hunt. For example, he said, the central image is a tree, but, well, it appears to remain just a tree. He was an Eliot Pound man, and at the time, I was into Billy Collins and the magic of the mundane. I had spent most of the poem describing the factual account of raking the leaves, and what I found underneath, from a broken, creepy doll my daughter lost to colonies of bugs I could not name, except for ants. He, the editor, had said there was no turn at the end to make it more than it is. But he missed my intent, which is easy to do, especially editors who don't read a poem all the way through. The end turned to time, as in the autumn of my life, I imagined when I was gone, the leaves would continue to fall for the next human to rake. Section 2. As poets are prone to do, so full of self-doubt, distrusting even the original muse, I embarked upon the inevitable second draft. I created a stream of sun to spotlight the undressed limbs, brought in the music of its roots in concert with neighbor trees, and added the orchestral arrangements of the birds that stopped in to sing. And even a side comment, how at night the tree became a nest of stars serenaded by the wind. My intent, I think, was to symbolize some sort of sacred musical brotherhood, a nature-human duet. Section 3. My wife, the real critic, read the new poem and was not impressed. Just like a narcissistic man, she said, you use the tree to talk about yourself. Why not let the tree be a tree? There's no meaning except what it is. Why not let the tree use you? I wasn't sure what she meant, but it seemed profound. After my usual creative pout, I entered the ring for the 3rd round. Section 4. Less is usually more, and I know the best poems are squeezed and squeezed until compressed into a polished stone that leaks no air, just a solid mass that reflects. I started pruning until only one word was left. Here's the poem now, Tree. Section 5. For the editor, this may not be enough, and probably not for you. A scientist may claim misfired neurons led me astray, or the God-striven failure once again to get inside the truth. But the tree is not its name, nor the poem a tree. Section 6. This autumn, go out to your favorite tree and rake the leaves, then pause and kneel to receive what it gives.
Bravo.
So, all poets and all writers are familiar with the rewriting routine, and that's something that you have to accept as part of the process.
Right. And it's interesting that it's difficult not to accept it as criticism rather than, oh, here's some possibilities of growth. And even though the less is more, you were growing by letting go. It sounds like.
Yeah, in some respects, the economic system of poetry is less is more. So as you reduce the number of words, what you're looking for are the right words, and so that becomes to me, one of the challenges, and that's why rewriting is so important, because oftentimes the first draft, uh, you have, especially if it's nostalgic, like my poems coming from growing up in the Delta, depending on memory. Nostalgia is dangerous because it can can really be a way to not remember correctly and polish things. So you can have false words in there. So finding the right words within that economy is very important. At least that's my opinion.
Well, I deeply respect your opinion. I appreciate you sharing your work with us. And truly, it's been a joy to speak with you today, Jack. And thanks to everyone who has joined us. I'm Marvel Harrison, and from all of us at Mimbres Press, may your day be sparked with curiosity and wonder. See you again on the next Writer's Life.